Have you ever had someone come up and ask you, what kinds of laws do you have to follow in the Bible? We know some of the familiar laws of the Ten Commandments. Those are the standard that Christians usually talk about. The laws like do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not fall into idolatry, take time to worship the Lord, and so on. But the thing about it is, interspersed within those laws sometimes and around those contexts where God gave the Ten Commandments are also laws about certain foods you can't eat, or not marrying somebody who's not a Jewish person, or laws about circumcision or worshiping on a specific day of the week. There's even a law about not eating shellfish in the Bible that people often bring up. So how do we know what laws to follow and what laws have passed aside, if you will? The key to answering that question is found in what the New Testament says. After all, we live in the New Testament age. We're New Testament Christians, and God speaks to our lives first and foremost through the New Testament scriptures. But it's also important that we understand the context in which some of those laws are given, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because sometimes Christians force things upon others that God doesn't command anymore. But sometimes the world doesn't want to listen to a particular law that God gives, which is still binding for us today. It really gets down to knowing our Bibles well in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And today in our devotion from the book The Passion of Jesus Christ by John Piper, we see a look at one of those specific laws and the impact that Christ's suffering, death, and resurrection had on that. Today our devotion for Wednesday, March 13th is that Christ suffered and died to abolish circumcision and all rituals as the basis of salvation. Now there's a reason why Piper highlights circumcision in particular, because if you read the book of Romans in the New Testament, or the book of Galatians, or some of the other letters, Ephesians, Colossians, the letters of Paul in particular, if you read those books, you'll see the topic of circumcision coming up again and again and again. That's because it was a major question for New Testament Christians, for churches that had a mixture of Jews and Gentiles. The question was, what do we do about circumcision, and how binding is that law on Christians today? You see, back in the Old Testament, God gave circumcision to his people as a command, as a way to separate them from the rest of the nations of the world. It was a sign of God's covenant to them. It was first given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 17, but it was practiced as a command in the Jewish nation all the way up to the time of Jesus. In fact, Jesus himself was circumcised. So the question becomes, after Jesus came, is circumcision still binding as a requirement from God? And the problem is that as a ritual, as a practice, it had kind of been turned into something that it was never intended to be. Certain people who called themselves Christians were saying that a person had to be circumcised in order to be saved. But that was something that God had never commanded himself. In fact, if you go all the way back to Genesis, God first promised Abraham that he was saved in Genesis 15, and then gave him circumcision as a sign of that salvation. And so by the time the New Testament age had come around, a lot of people were saying more about circumcision than there was supposed to be said. But the suffering and death of Christ also had an impact on that ritual and that practice. Our Bible passages for today spell that out pretty clearly. The first one from Galatians 5:11 says, "But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, the offense of the cross has been removed." Our second passage comes a chapter later in the book of Galatians, from chapter 6, verse 12. "It is those who want to make a good showing in the flesh who would force you to be circumcised, and only in order that they may not be persecuted for the cross of Christ." Paul makes it pretty clear in not only the letter to the Galatians, but in other books, that Circumcision was not a requirement for salvation. It was a matter of Christian freedom now that Christ had come and accomplished his work on the cross. Notice in each of those passages from Galatians that Paul says, if you make more of circumcision than should be made, if you command more of it than should be commanded, you take away from the cross of Christ. You see, the reason God gave circumcision in the Old Testament and some of the other laws that we call ceremonial laws, laws that are no longer binding today, the reason God gave those things was to keep his people focused on the Messiah coming. In the letter to the Colossians, Paul talked about that as being like a shadow of things to come. Those laws indicated what Christ was standing for and what he would do when he came. But once Christ comes, you don't look at his shadow anymore. You look at the person. You look at the substance. And so the cross of Christ, the suffering and death of Jesus, fulfilled those commands from God. Now, there are certainly still laws from God that were given in the Old Testament that are still binding today, things we call the moral laws of God, and those would be the 10 Commandments. And the reason we know those things are still binding today on all people is how God talks about them in the New Testament as well. The cross of Christ does not abolish those laws. But this is very important for us to understand so that we don't allow laws into our lives that would detract from the cross of Christ. Circumcision is just one example in many. It may not be a real big problem in today's churches as it was in the New Testament church at the very beginning. But what other types of laws could be present in our Christian lives that would detract from the cross of Christ? Some churches say you need to choose Christ as your Savior or decide that He's your Lord. Some churches say that you have to look like a Christian on the outside. You have to act in certain ways, or your life has to be exemplified in certain scenarios in order for you to be sure that you're saved. The Roman Catholic Church teaches that many different types of good works are needed in order to be saved. Let us never allow any of these things to detract from what our Savior came to do. He has abolished the ceremonial law. He has fulfilled it. And we are living in the fruits and the freedom of the gospel.